Now, another interesting factor here is something called as consumption. Okay. I want to talk about consumption in the context of scrapping. Consumption. Consumption. What is consumption? Consumption is how much goods has been consumed. SAP keeps track of that. How much goods have been consumed. Similar to the way SAP tracks how much goods have been produced or how much goods have been stored in the storage location. All of these aggregates, I'm calling them aggregates because those are numbers that keep accumulating over a number of transactions. If you go to MMBE and say that there are 100 pounds, so that 100 could have been got over there through n number of transactions, like 5 purchase orders, each 20 pounds would have accumulated to 100. That accumulation is what I'm calling as aggregation. So SAP keeps having these aggregates. Stock is one example of aggregate. Similarly, consumption is another example of aggregate. So when you look at consumption, scrap is not an example of consumption. Well, what do I mean by that? When you sell goods to the customer, say coffee, that is consumption. When you use coffee for internal consumption and let me put it this way. When you use coffee beans for internal consumption, prepare a latte, give it to your customer, that's also called as consumption. So whether you sell it to a customer or use it to make or manufacture something else, those are examples of consumption. There are more examples that we'll see later. Scrapping is not an example of consumption because it's just being wasted. It's not consumed. But where do you see consumption to start with? Go to the material master /n mm03, put your coffee beans or any material. Okay. Enter general plant source location data. And we're talking about Chicago plant and coffee beans storage location. And go to additional data. And you should see a tab called consumption. Now, you'll only see the consumption tab when you specify the plant and storage location. If you don't specify those org elements, you don't see the consumption tab. So if you just go to MM01 or try to open up consumption from the additional data, you won't see consumption. Consumption will only be available as a tab in additional data if you specify the plant and storage location. All right, so what do we see here? Total consumption, corrected value, blah, blah, blah. I'm interested in this column, consumption, total consumption. And the other column is period. So the aggregation or calculation that SAP is doing is by period. So it's saying that in October, 10 is October, right? 10th month. In October 2016, the total consumption is 125 pounds. that could have been consumed over n number of transactions. This 125 over here could be a result of 5 different customer transactions. 60 pounds could have been sold to a customer. 60 pounds would have been consumed for making coffee by the barista. And another 5 pounds could be used for a birthday party. These are all examples of consumption. And SAP tracks consumption by period. So in the 10th month, it has consumed 125 pounds. But when I scrapped 100 pounds of coffee, I said SAP should not deem it as consumption because it's not really consumption. Now, why am I so worried about deeming it as consumption or not? That's probably a more important question. And why is consumption important? Okay, we consumed 125 pounds in October. What's the big deal? Well, the big deal is that consumption is an important parameter for planning. What planning? Well, in the month of October, we consumed 125 pounds. In the month of November, we might consume around the same amount or a little bit more. Maybe it's Thanksgiving, so you might consume 10 or 50 pounds more. Right? So consumption in any given period is a very valuable indicator of how much we might consume in the next quarter, next month, next year. We could accumulate that. So consumption, like I said, is a very important parameter in calculating future usage. Think of Apple. Apple released a new product, iPhone, some version. Now, in the first month, how many iPhones should it manufacture? It will typically base it off of previous releases, first month production. Right? And then, of course, it will make some marketing adjustments because last year the demand was so much. This year the demand might be 10% more. But there should be some baseline based on which it tries to get to a solid number and then do some adjustments off of that. And that is based on consumption. Another example. I have a restaurant. Say I sold 100 biryanis today. Tomorrow, how many biryanis should I sell? Well, that depends on the customers, but how many biryanis should I keep ready? Well, I based it off of my yesterday's consumption, right? Otherwise, I wouldn't have a clue how many I should make. So consumption is a very important parameter, and SAP very rightly keeps track of that, and it does that by period. So in this period, this is the aggregate consumption. When I mean aggregate, just think of totals. This is the total consumption. Aggregate is a word that's used these days in the context of HANA, but bottom line is aggregate means total. So SAP does calculate aggregations, and consumption is a very important parameter. Okay. Now, when we receive goods from a purchase order, you update the stock. When you issue goods to a customer or for your barista to make coffee, that's called consumption. So consumption is updated. And of course, stock is also removed and updated, but consumption is another parameter that's updated. where is the configuration for that? In many places, like material type, right? We have seen that the material type has a quantity upgrade, value update. That's one parameter. Another parameter is the movement type. If I use a particular movement type, should I update the quantity or value? That's a piece of configuration. Let's go to the movement type. OMJJ. Right? Select movement type. And we want to check, let's say movement type 101. Right? That's a standard movement type when you receive goods against a purchase order. And if you go to update control, there you'll see value upgrade versus quantity upgrade. Value update versus quantity update. That means that 101 does value update yes or no, or quantity update yes or no for a particular movement and now these two columns control whether value updates and quantity updates happen. And this column over here, CNS stands for consumption. This column over here says whether consumption should be updated or not. So there are different values for it. A blank means that there is no consumption, right? V means it's consumption, A means it's consumption against an asset, against a sales order, so on and so forth. But a blank value here means that there is no consumption. So here is the row that corresponds to a goods receipt done against a PO. So we have value update. So when goods receipt is done against a PO, meaning if you order 100 pounds of coffee from vendor 4001, and when it's time to do the goods receipt, you use movement type 101, and when you use that, value is updated and quantity is updated. Now, why am I only specifically selecting that row, not so many other rows? Well, this is the relevant row, and I know that because what is the movement here? It's B. What does B stand for? B stands for goods movement for purchase order, and that's what we're trying to do, right? 101 is goods movement against a purchase order. So select B, and I know that that's the row for purchase order. And what kind of a receipt is that? Is it a stock transport order or is it a regular PO? A blank means it's a normal receipt and X means it's an STO. Well, we are not talking about an STO now. We're talking about a regular goods receipt. So it's blank. And what's the consumption? Consumption is blank. That means there is no consumption. Is it fair? Is it correct? When you receive goods against a purchase order, do you increase the stock? Yes, we increase the stock. This check mark says that it increases the stock. And this check mark says that the value is also increased, meaning the corresponding account is updated. B says that it's a purchase order. Blank says that it's a normal PO. And a blank over here means that there is no consumption. Well, do we need to update consumption? No, it's not a consumption, right? We are receiving the goods. no need to update consumption, right? So when you're trying to do a goods receipt, normal goods receipt, not a stock transport order, consumption is not updated. Well, that's expected, right? But when is it updated? Typically in case of issues. A simple example of an issue could be 201. Consumption against a cost center. The HR department wants some papers, they're consuming papers. Or somebody in the company wants to purchase coffee from our own shop. That's an example of internal consumption, right? Maybe we want to give some coffee for free. So 100 pounds of coffee is being withdrawn to be distributed to the employees, 1 pound each or 10 pounds each. That is an example of internal consumption. What's the movement type for that? 201. So let's go back and select go back to OMJJ, and if you look at material types like 543, goods issue, sales order stock, you see that there is a consumption posting. In this case, the consumption posting is G. What does G stand for? Planned withdrawal. If it is blank, then there is no consumption. If it is G, then there is consumption. So consumption account is updated typically in case of issues where we are issuing stock to an asset, where we are issuing stock to a project or to a customer. So wherever you see a blank, that means that for that particular movement type, consumption is not updated. So 551 is an example of goods movement, in this case scrapping, where the consumption is not updated. And why is it not updated? Because it's not really consumption. It's scrapping, where we're not consuming, but we're just wasting it away. Now, if you look at 201, goods issue for cost center, you can see that there's a consumption here. Consumption is of type R. What does R stand for? R is planned or unplanned with reference to a reservation. Well, it could be with reference to a reservation or without reference to a reservation. But the bottom line is, when you're consuming it internally, still it is consumption. So essentially, I'm trying to harp around the point of consumption. Some movement types induce consumption and some movement types do not. How do you know which movement type induces consumption and which movement type does not? So if you go to OMJJ movement type configuration, every movement type is associated either with no consumption or with some kind of consumption. So scrapping using movement type 551 does not do consumption. Now you understand what is consumption, why certain types of transactions induce consumption and why sometimes they don't, and what are the parameters that control consumption. Movement type. Okay, that's example of sampling and scrapping. Let's see another example of issues. Issue against cost center. We have used this a lot of times. Anytime we want to do an issue without reference to a PO or sales order, we use 201. Right? All you have to do is go to MIGO, put 201, material, plant, and storage location. And when you put 201, you always put the cost center, because that is the cost element, or that is the department that's gonna suck that cost. That was another example of issues. Now, there are more kinds of issues. You could issue goods against sales order, right? Now, sales order is something that is a little more elaborate. Now, in order to really test that, we have to do so many different things, like do the enterprise structure for sales order, so on and so forth. The bottom line is it's a little bit more involved. We don't want to really get there at this point or at any point for an consultant. So, against a sales order, there is a particular movement type. I think it's 601. So, against a sales order. So, a customer comes in and asks for 10 pounds of coffee. You create a sales order. Now, we have not seen that in the system yet, and we don't need to see them as consultants. The SD consultant will create a sales order, and he'll create a delivery which will deliver 10 pounds or 1 pound of coffee. And when it is done, it's a case of issuing 10 pounds of coffee against a sales order. And you mention the sales order number, and the movement type is 601. What other types of movements are there? Against a project. What's a project? Well, think about a birthday party happening in our coffee house. Let's say we do birthday parties in our coffee shop. We have a separate room where, let's say, you come in as a customer and you want to host a birthday party. Well, we'll assign a helper to you, and then you pay in advance, say $100 or $200, and we'll get you the cakes, we'll decorate the party, we'll get coffees, mochas, whatever, right? So all these issues, because these are all issues, the coffee is made against what? Not against a customer, not against a cost center, but against a project. And the project in this case is a party. There is a set budget for it. Say $600 is the max limit. And you keep doing that project. At the end of the project, all the costs are accumulated. So we had 100 coffees, 3 big cakes, 100 different pastries, so many party hats, so much for decoration, so much for hosting, so much for the rent, so on and so forth. And the total is $600 or $900. So against that project, you keep issuing goods and settle the bill with the customer after the project is done, right? So the movement type for that is 221. I could take you to the project systems, create a project, do a goods issue against a project, but it will just confuse the hell out of you. Don't worry. Think of it as another transaction. That's it. Nothing so great about it. You issue goods against a project, And when you think of project, think of birthday party. The movement type that's used is 221. I just made a note of them offline on paper and I'm just presenting to you. So don't worry about getting them all into your heart right away. It's not important. You can just go to movement types and then see what each of them mean. Or you could keep this sheet handy, take a printout of this, keep it handy is one of your screenshots, and refer to these movement types when you have a question. Now, against an asset. Asset. What do I mean by asset? Coffee making machine. That's $10,000. It's a big machine. That's an asset. Say, for example, the coffee making machine consumes coffee filters. Okay, coffee filters. Say we have to replace it every week. And it becomes part of the asset, right? Once you replace it with a new one, that new filter becomes part of the asset. The asset is the element that's eating the cost of all these filters. So you keep 10 filters in stock, and anytime a filter replacement is needed, you do a goods issue against the asset and use movement type 241, right? Now, you could also issue goods against a production order. There is a special order to produce a 10-pound cake, and 10-pound cake requires 8 pounds of flour, 2 pounds of sugar, so much of butter, colors, cream, so on and so forth, right? All of them have to be issued for that order. It's a special order. The movement type for that is 261. The baker creates the production order, and against that production order, goods will be issued using movement type 261. There are more examples. Goods issues against internal orders, so on and so forth. And each of them have a specific movement type. So these are all examples of issues. And examples of receipts are against PO. So with a PO or without a PO. These are some of the most used examples. Now there are also examples of receipts where a production order is complete for 10 pounds of cake and you receive the goods against production order. That uses a certain movement type. Now, do you need to remember that? Oh, not necessarily. Now, there are so many different movement types, right? That use just assume that it uses a different movement type. Now, against a project produces certain deliverables, physical goods, like it created a generator. You want to put it in stock? Sure. Against a project, you could receive goods. Similarly, against a sales order, if the customer sent back the coffee saying it's stale, you receive the goods against that sales order's delivery. So, most of the issues will typically have some kind of returns, and they can all be done using goods receipts or some kind of reversal. So, 221 is against stock, 222 could be a reversal of issuing goods against the stock, which is a receipt. right? Now, what is the takeaway from the screen for you? I've got this complicated screen with so many different issues, so many different receipts, and other processes like sampling, scrapping, converting from one material to another. What is the takeaway? The takeaway is there are three categories of processes that happen in the warehouse purely in terms of inventory management. You receive goods against different references, against a PO, without a PO, against a production order, against a project, so on and so forth. So these are all examples of receipts. They increase the stock. And what do you do with the stock? You don't keep it with you all the time. You have to either issue it or scrap it. When you do issues, you issue it against internal order. You issue it for QA. You issue it against a cost center, sales order, project, asset, production order. They'll reduce the stock. So this will increase the stock. This will reduce the stock. And if you don't sell that much, you gotta scrap the stock or convert it into a different material if you're able to sell it. So these are some internal processes. These are inbound. We are receiving the goods, and these are outbound, where we are issuing the goods either into our own warehouse for manufacturing something or out of our warehouse, out of our hands to customers. Again, the whole purpose of this slide is to understand that goods keep coming in, they use different movement types. Goods keep going out, they use different movement types. And internally, you could transfer or do some kind of juggling or manipulation of goods, and they use different kinds of movement types. Like I said, you don't need to remember all the movement types. Unnecessary. 5 or 10 different movement types at most, and remember them by doing the transactions. There is no need for you to get them by heart. Just remember those 4 or 5 different movement types, and that's good enough. But understand that a movement type basically represents either a physical or virtual movement of goods. In case of conversion, this is an example of virtual movement. In case of scrapping, this is an example of virtual movement. Or sometimes it's physical movement, like moving or issuing goods against a sales order. When you do that, goods are physically transferred over to the customer.